Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, July 19th, 2023. Today, we're talking about striking the root rather than just hacking at branches. The founders, the old revolutionaries, most of them really considered it a duty to protect our Constitution and liberty. Not just a good idea, not something to think about later on, but an actual moral duty. There was a pretty strong moral compass about that. I want to start out with, and I'm going to wrap it up with Samuel Adams as well, the founder or the father of the American Revolution. Here, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette, the publication that was the primary outlet for the Sons of Liberty in October of 1771, he said, "The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending at all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks. Not just the worst one, but it's our duty to defend our liberty and our Constitution against all attacks." Now, unfortunately, though, even among the small number of people, there are not many people who are on board with the Constitution and liberty today if we're considering the big picture. It's an unfortunate reality. But even among those who are on our side, the vast majority of that small percentage are really just hacking at branches rather than striking at the root. You may be familiar, you probably are familiar with some version of this famous quote from Henry David Thoreau in Walden. Now, he was talking about economic issues and philanthropy here, but it's applicable really in whatever issue you're talking about. He said, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." And the ones who are hacking at the branches, a lot of times it just makes it worse. If you really think about this in figuring out the root cause of our problem when it comes to government, the largest government in history, and addressing it, that's the cure. Everything else is just chasing after symptoms and oftentimes making things worse, or at very least does nothing for healing. And then if you think about it in terms of this extended metaphor that Thoreau was using of a tree or a plant, if you actually want to get rid of the plant or the tree and you just prune it instead, any of you have done any gardening, I'm terrible at it. My mother was amazing. I try every now and then, but well, one of these days. We're growing some basil, finally. If you want to get rid of a plant and you just prune it, what you actually do is you stimulate the growth of new branches. And oftentimes it becomes even stronger than it was before. Or if you cut off all the leaves and the branches and you just leave a stump, but you leave the root as well, it could very well grow back again and again, even stronger. And that's an important part of what we're talking about here so often, that if you don't take the right approach, you're not going to get good results. And really, this is really all about power. And one of the primary ways that I think that people take this pruning approach, and I've talked about this in a number of recent episodes, is every couple of years they try to find new people to run the largest government in history, as if the only issue that we have is a personnel problem. You just got to get the right people in this agency, and that agency will no longer be rogue. You got to get the right people in this level of office, and that office will do the right thing. But if you're relying on human nature to do the right thing, you're going to be very disappointed. I've over and over cited Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head. But he said, show me that age and country, and this is going to be my butchered paraphrase here. Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were put in the hands of, well, just relying on their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. He said every such mad attempt means you would lose liberty. So if you're really just hoping to get the right people in positions of power to use the power the right way, rather than addressing the root cause, which is the power in and of itself, it's always going to get worse, even if sometimes it seems temporarily better on issues that are important to you. Most people think of things in partisan ways. Here's how Abigail Adams put it. This is in a letter to John Adams in November of 1775. She said, "Power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping." It doesn't matter. Well, power, whether vested many or in a few, is ever grasping. And like the grave cries, "Give, give." It is always calling, and the fact that she tied it in with the grave, the inevitable. "The great fish," she said, "swallow up the small. And he who is most strenuous for the rights of the people when vested with power, is as eager after the prerogatives of government. So even the people who sound good on rights and liberty and issues of power, once they are in a position of power, once they're vested with power, well, we can't trust them either. And it's really, I don't know if it's ironic or if she was warning her husband, John Adams, because I think John Adams is a great example of this. Certainly, when it came to being the Atlas of Independence and talking about consent of the government and property rights and liberty and always defending liberty at all hazards, he was fantastic. But once he was vested with power, just as his wife told him so many years earlier, then he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law in 1798. So it's a great example of don't trust people with power, including the people who tell you don't trust people with power, like John Adams. Here he is in 1775, writing in his Novanglus Essays number 3. He said, "The nature of encroachment, because like the growth of a plant or a weed, for example, unless you strike at the root, it will always grow back, and it grows back faster and faster." Here, John Adams compares it to a disease. He said the nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. He goes on, he said, the revenue creates pensioners, and the pensioners urge for more revenue. It sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Once you get people reliant upon government handouts, government being, well, mom and dad, their educator, the provider of their retirement accounts, the protector of everything. Then people become dependent upon it, and then, well, they raise their children to be dependent upon it, and it gets worse and worse and worse, and it speeds up, and it gets bigger and bigger. And so when people think, well, how did things get so bad so fast? When I was a kid, everything was cool, but it wasn't really, because as soon as they got off the rails with as soon as the people allowed, and I'm kind of tipping my hat to where I'm going with this. I think those of you who watch or listen to the show, you know where I'm going. But once the people have allowed things to go wrong, even for the smallest step, as Thomas Jefferson put it, a single step beyond the limits of the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress, as somehow he said it in 1791, he said, is to take a boundless field of power, because the precedent always builds upon this. This was the recognition from Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike that humans are flawed creatures, that power will always seek to expand, and even just as Abigail Adams said to John Adams before John Adams did exactly what she predicted, was that even when the people who are most in favor of the rights of the people get vested with power, they are very much interested in expanding that power. But here's John Adams going. He said, so the revenue creates pensioners, and the pensioners urge for more revenue. The people grow less steady, spirited, and virtuous. The seekers more numerous and more corrupt, and every day increases the circles of their dependence and expectance. This is a perfect description of what we live under today and have been living under for many years, because this has been growing for a long, long time. He said, until virtue, integrity, public spirit, simplicity, frugality become the objects of ridicule and scorn, and vanity, luxury, foppery, selfishness, meanness, and downright venality swallow up the whole society. Again, a great description of what we live under today. Now, Benjamin Franklin put it this way here in the Philadelphia Convention, June of 1788. He said, we're not trying to establish a king, but if you're going to look through history, you can see how people with power have acted. He said, there is scarce a king in 100 who would not, if he could, follow the example of Pharaoh. Get first all the people's money, then all their lands, and then make them and their children servants forever. This is the socialist. Well, this is really the Trotskyite model. Take everything. No real private property. The ownership of the means of productions is in the hands of people with power, whether it's government or their supporters, whatever it may be. And, well, I think Benjamin Franklin called it as well. And that's why power has to be kept in check. And it's not, I'll get into this a little bit more. It has to be kept in check. It's not just about giving new people power. The problem is the power itself. So even if you have someone who will follow the rules perfectly or always do the right thing, they're not going to live forever. And eventually someone else will say, well, I could do things a little differently with all that power. I'm bumping my microphone here. Sorry. I can do things a little bit differently here. And eventually, as long as the power is not limited, if it's not restricted, if you're not chopping out the roots of that evil power, then it's going to grow and grow and grow and grow. Here's how Richard Henry Lee put it in a letter to Patrick Henry in 1789. It must never be forgotten that the liberties of the people are not so safe under the gracious manner of government as by the limitation of power. Now, I covered this all in much more detail in an episode last week. You're not going to vote your way to liberty. I did a lot of Spooner talk in that one, so if you like that kind of thing, it's going to be pretty interesting going back and forth between Spooner and views from the founders and the old revolutionaries. But here's the TLD, I guess, DW. Too long, didn't watch. Choosing new people to wield power is not how you limit power. I'm going to link to these original source documents, that episode, a couple of articles that I'm going to be mentioning here in just a moment, over in a blog post. I publish a blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty about 1 to 2 hours after every live stream is done. And there, again, you're going to find a show notes section where you can find all these source documents. Read, learn more, listen to other episodes on your own time, because I'm just scratching the surface on this stuff. Education is not something that we've really been given. We've been given propaganda from cradle to grave, whether we were in a government-run school or in a government-approved school. And so we really haven't gotten a true education. We are in an age of information. It's all out there. And I'm doing my best to learn and grow in my own way and share it as much as possible with you. So I hope you guys find this interesting. I hope you find it educational, and I hope it will encourage you to do more research on this stuff on your own time. So over in that blog post, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty, you'll also find all the different platforms we're on. I want to let you know that I'm very grateful for those of you who've been following us on some of the alternative platforms, we can call them that, like rumble.com, odyssey.com. We also live stream and have archive videos all over the place. The mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Twitch. We're at sovereign.com, which is great. No live streaming there as of yet, but we're doing all the archives there. And we have the audio-only podcast edition on almost every platform that I can think of. If we're missing one, let me know in the comments or email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Let me take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you guys all being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Kirk Morrison, good to see you, buddy. Cheriton Farmer, Haji in Southeast Michigan, Douglas Fox, Jacob Roynan Fisher. That's a name I haven't seen before. If this is your first time on the live, good to see you. If I've missed you, I apologize. Joseph Bonamolo, John Rhyme, Fort Frost River, The Grand Level, and a few others. I know I'm skipping over a few here, but I want to get back to the content. Again, I hope you guys are finding this interesting and educational, and I'm not real boring in my presentation. So again, the first way that a lot of people hack at branches is just trying to find people to wield power and not really stop the power, because it never stops growing if you just change the people in office. And first of all, most of the time, the changes aren't even that good if you can even get changes. So that's a side note. The next way that people hack at branches rather than strike at the root is that they blame the Constitution itself. It's the document's fault. We're not taking responsibility. Those bad people, well, they're just getting power because this document told them to do it. And that's how Mike Maharrey put it in an article we published this morning. Whose fault is this? This is really good stuff. A lot of people blame the Constitution itself, citing a famous quote by abolitionist Lysander Spooner, who I love quoting on this show, who wrote that the Constitution, well, mind you, he wrote this in the appendix to No Treason, number 6, and most people cite it out of context. They don't really know what he was talking about there. He wrote that the Constitution either authorized the government we got or it was powerless to stop it and therefore is unfit to exist. Now, here's the truth. Words on paper don't enforce themselves. They don't make anyone do something. They don't make anyone stop doing something. They never could, and they never will. And Mike gets into this just briefly. He said, even at the time of the founding, during the ratification debates, people generally, this is Mike's professionalism here, I would add a little hyperbole. No one expected the Constitution to enforce itself, but Mike puts it much better than I do. People generally understood that constitutions were powerless to restrain a government. After all, they're just words on paper. Or as James Madison and others described them, they were parchment barriers. And I've mentioned it many times on the show, but I figure it deserves another one here. Madison warned against relying on parchment barriers alone in Federalist number 48 twice. Near the top of the essay, he says, this is basically this just have the proper stuff on paper in a parchment barrier has been what people have relied upon in most of the constitutions, the state constitutions, and it's been a miserable failure. And then he wraps it up at the end with this. The conclusion which I am warranted in drawing from these observations is that a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. The greatest threat to liberty is centralization of power. Even when the person with centralized power does the right thing again, eventually someone else will have that power. So the founding generation was widely opposed to total centralization of power, unless, of course, you're like a Hamiltonian. I mean, there, of course, were a few outliers, but the general view, and especially from the general public, was against a total consolidation. And Madison points out that just giving them rules on paper, if you're relying on the government to follow the rules without some type of enforcement, without something else, it's always going to grow in power. And here's how Meharry put it. Parchment barriers need enforcement. And that's where we've had a breakdown. He cites John Dickinson, who in Fabius letter number 3, I generally cite 4, so this is a nice add to our repertoire here. He talks about how, well, there's a clear, this is Dickinson, who was the primary author of, or the lead guy for the Articles of Confederation. Here he was arguing in favor of ratification of the Constitution some years later, again, 1788. He was pointing out, like, look, the dividing line between federal and state power is pretty clear. The feds do a very little number of things. As James Madison put it in Federalist 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those reserved to the states and the people are numerous and indefinite. And Dickinson is giving that kind of a message as well. But he said, like, if it doesn't work out, if the central government, the general government, invades, and they often use that term invade. When the government does stuff it's not supposed to be doing, it's a usurpation, it's a theft of power, it's invading, going beyond the line that they're not authorized to go. So it's considered an invasion. And if they invade into the residuary powers or the residual powers, reserved powers of the people in the states, he said, it will be their own faults. And he did that in highlights. He put it in italics. It will be their own faults if the several states suffer the federal sovereignty to interfere in things of their own respective jurisdictions. So who's to blame? To John Dickinson? If the states don't do something, it's their own fault. And here's how James Madison put it in the Virginia resolutions of 1798 against those hated Alien and Sedition Acts that were signed by John Adams. He said, in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, in other words, not delegated to the federal government in the Constitution, when the federal government does stuff that they're not authorized to do. So in the case of that, now Jefferson was a little broader in his Kentucky resolutions of 1798, which I'll get to in a minute, but he basically said anytime they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, the states are supposed to take action. Madison was a little bit more moderate in this, but where he said it was deliberate, palpable, and a dangerous exercise. Now, that's going to be determined on a person-by-person, a state-by-state basis. He said the states who are in that situation, the states who are parties thereto of the Constitution, have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. Think about that. It's our right to stand up for our own Constitution, to defend our own Constitution, and defend our own liberty. But for Madison, it was the duty. If it was a state government involved, and the federal government is doing stuff that's supposed to be reserved to the states, and the states don't do anything about it, they've violated their oath. Because if you take an oath to protect and defend, to support the Constitution for the United States, you take an oath to protect the Constitution of your own state, and the federal government does stuff that goes beyond those limits, well, then you're violating your oath by doing nothing. Merely standing idly by and watching it is violating your oath. You don't deserve to be there. You don't deserve support. So I guess what we're getting at here, I don't know. I'm just maybe going off on a few things. One way that people hack at branches rather than striking at the root is by blaming a document. And if you blame the document, you think the document's at fault, well, then either get rid of the document or change the document. And that'll solve it, and then it doesn't. Another way, and I think probably the primary one, is by putting a massive amount of time, energy, and all the millions and millions, probably billions of dollars into trying to get new people to run the largest government in history. But that's not even what we're supposed to be doing in this type of situation. And I know I keep citing it over and over, but when it comes to dealing with a government that is not within the bounds of the Constitution, just merely changing the people in power, is not how someone like Thomas Jefferson recommended we're supposed to deal with things. He said, here he is in his draft for the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, again against the Alien and Sedition Acts from John Adams. He said, in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. So using powers in a bad way that are using powers that are delegated in the Constitution to the federal government in ways that you think are terrible, are dumb, in wrong ways, but still within the limits of the Constitution. If you don't like that, you think it's wrong, then you do the vote the bums out strategy. But that's the only time. When you're talking about a scenario where they're violating the Constitution, where they're invading the rights and liberties of the people, where they're invading the reserved powers of the people in the states, that's a whole different scenario. And Jefferson put it this way. He said, but where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. And he went further and explained why. Every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. Without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. So, unless the people have created a constitution where the people and the states are united, the United States, under a principle of what Jefferson called earlier in the document of unlimited submission to the general government, to the federal government, and that's what we have today. Basically, what people have done is when the government does stuff that the government isn't supposed to be doing, they go to the government and ask or beg or demand, pretend to boss around the people that are doing the wrong things and tell them to stop doing the things that they were never supposed to be doing in the first place, whether it's through courts, through protests, through marches on Washington, D.C., trying to get new people in there that will somehow magically do something that never happens, which is hand back all the power that's been given to them in the first place. Anyways, back to Mike Maharrey. He said, in a nutshell, we can't blame the Constitution for not enforcing itself. And the mechanism for preserving the Constitution and keeping the federal government within its limits was in place from the beginning. The states didn't do their job. They have not done their job right from the start. And in the times that they've tried, and sometimes they've actually been successful, a lot of times people have just backed down. It's too difficult, it's too scary, or maybe people aren't on board with the ideas of the Constitution and liberty. They don't want limited, centralized. They don't want decentralized power. They want centralized power and control because they live in fear. That should be another episode in and of itself. And Mike says, but when you get to the root of things, there is another culprit, because ultimately we can't even blame state governments for being bad, because if the people tolerate it, then who's the real problem here? There is another culprit, the people themselves. Here's how George Washington put it in his 1783 circular to the states as the War for Independence, the American Revolution, which led up to that point, was winding down. But that was really just the revolution. I guess that's the wrong way to put it. I should do an episode on that as well. The revolution, that was really just the beginning of the revolution, the War for Independence. And it's, can you keep the principles of the revolution alive in the decades to come? No. But here's how Washington put it in 1783. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation. And if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. So if we're not free and happy at the same time, now Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, discussed what is freedom. And he pointed out that we cannot be happy without being free. Without freedom is the basis of everything. And so if we're not going to have both of those, if we're not going to have freedom, we're not going to have prosperity, it is the fault of the people, according to George Washington. And that's what Meharry was getting at as well. And he put it this way. He's citing John Dickinson. In Fabius number 4, which I've cited many times, Dickinson revisited the idea of holding government in check. Mind you, in Fabius number 3, he pointed out that it's the duty of the states to take action when the federal government goes beyond its limits. And if they don't, and they let the federal government invade their reserved powers, it's their own fault. But ultimately, it's a bigger problem if both the states and the feds are doing bad stuff. The bigger problem is the people themselves. Dickinson noted that a good constitution promotes, but not always produces, a good administration. So even if you have a great, perfect constitution, which is impossible because we're human beings and human beings can't do something that's perfect. So ultimately, you're even with the best constitution possible, he's saying a bad administration may take place. What is then to be done, was asked. And Meharry puts it this way. His answer was that it's ultimately up to, quote, the supreme sovereignty of the people. It is their duty to watch, wrote Dickinson, and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. So ultimately, again, there's that word duty. It's not just a good idea. It's the duty of the people to protect their own stuff. If we're going to have freedom, we have to have some responsibility. I discussed that in an episode a couple of months ago as well. Ultimately, it is up to the people. So if we're striking at the root, it's not, again, about the politicians. The politicians, of course, are terrible. The deep state is terrible. Military-industrial complex, all this stuff is really bad. But ultimately, the minds that have to be changed are of the general population. Here's how John Hancock put it in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. So if you're concerned about the federal government, John Hancock is saying as well, same thing. George Washington says it will be their own fault if the people are not free. Dickinson is saying this. Madison is telling us that there has to be something else other than a parchment barrier. Jefferson is saying changing the people in office only is supposed to be done when they're within the bounds of the Constitution. And other than that, it's up to the people in the states to use this natural right of nullification. The powers reserved by the people render them secure. The people have not been using them, unfortunately. Here's how Meharry puts it. And that brings us back to Lysander Spooner. It's good to kind of wrap up with this. Well, not fully wrapped up, but soon. In response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Spooner penned a pamphlet, which I've cited on this show many, many times, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves. He argued that the right and the physical power of the people to resist injustice are the only security they have for their liberties. And this is how Spooner put it. Practically no government knows any limit to its power but the endurance of the people. So if the people are literally just trying to get the government to stop doing the things the government shouldn't have been doing in the first place, government will keep doing those things and more and more and more unless the people themselves draw a line in the sand. Now, there are various levels of this. Dickinson talked about this in his Letters from a Farmer of Pennsylvania. Basically, you start out with some petitions, you build it up with noncompliance, you only go from step to step to step over time, and that's really what they did throughout the Revolution as well. That's why we teach so much of that history here at 10th Amendment Center. But here's how Spooner put it. He said, the right of the people, therefore, to resist usurpation. Usurpation is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states by the federal government. So when government steals power, does stuff it's not supposed to do, the right of the people to resist it is strictly a constitutional right, which I think is an interesting take. I don't necessarily agree. I think it's a natural right for people to be able to resist it, but me and Spooner can argue that elsewhere. But he continued, and the exercise of the right is neither rebellion against the Constitution nor revolution. It is a maintenance of the Constitution itself by keeping the government within the Constitution. So ultimately, striking the root requires the people to resist actions of the government that go beyond the limits of power that are delegated to it in the Constitution. Without that, it will never change. And that is how you maintain the Constitution itself. James Iredell, one of the first Associate Justices of the Supreme Court, put it this way, same thing. The only resource against usurpation, the only way, It's not just a good idea, not something to try later, but the only thing that can stop usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. Again, striking the root, ultimately, the biggest problem we face is that a vast majority of people, we are literally surrounded by people who hate liberty, who are totally ignorant about it. They don't understand it. Maybe they've been trained or taught to not love it, but they have to learn about it. They also have to learn the original legal meaning of the Constitution. As Samuel Adams put it in that same letter that I cited right at the beginning, that same essay, Candidus in the Boston Gazette in 1771, he said, "The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought." We are missing on both counts in a big way. Most people do not value freedom, and almost no one defends it as they ought, whether it's through noncompliance or more direct resistance. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. I hope we can reach and teach more people. We work really hard every single day to get this kind of information out to more people, and nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. Throw a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing and destroying. Throw it our way. We will use it in the most efficient way possible. You wouldn't believe how we get by on a tiny little budget that is nowhere close to most other organizations that are just partisan hacks. So 10thamendmentcenter.com/members are where you can join us for as little as $2 a month. We also have annual, lifetime, and 5-year options. Please check them out there. No obligation, no pressure, but I'm just asking to please consider it as well. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or question. Jacob Roynan Fisher says, Abigail Adams was an awesome woman. Let's be honest. Yeah, I like Abigail a lot. The more that I read from her, she really pushed. I tried putting together an episode a while back about how she was really, really pushing John Adams towards independence. We have a lot of high-sounding words, she said at one point, but very little action. You guys are all talk. Come on, let's get this done. A lot of really interesting back and forth from her. Jefferson wrote back and forth with her as well. See what else. Frost River says, tyranny is an evil weed of usurpation. Yeah, that's, I think whatever the analogy that we're using, whether it's something that takes root and grows and grows and grows, or like John Adams had said, it's like a cancer. It grows faster and faster every hour. It's pretty interesting stuff. Anyways, I will look a little bit more through John says, what YouTube suppresses this content. Probably Rumble is rocking. We're just going to keep putting out the information. I'm going to keep doing the show on all the platforms possible, whether they love us or not. I mean, they're at least allowing us to be there for now. So as long as we can get some eyeballs or ears on this information, we're going to be everywhere possible. So I appreciate you guys wherever you watch or listen to the show. And if you want us to be on a different platform, maybe we're missing from something, please just let me know, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Or if you've got suggestions for a future episode, questions on this, so on. I don't get a chance to reply to too many comments or questions, but I do my best to read through all of them as well. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you're having a great day, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.